The Second World War in Europe began at dawn on September 1st, 1939, when 1.5 million German troops crossed the western Polish frontier. Some crossed into Poland in the seats of bombers, like the Stuka. Others drove into Poland in trucks, armored fighting vehicles, and tanks. Still others crossed the border on motorcycles, on foot, and horseback. Their goal was all the same: destroy the Polish military and government, occupy the country. As the German Navy bombarded the Westerplatte, the Luftwaffe bombed bridges and civilian centers throughout the country. Meanwhile, the German soldiers gleefully tore down Polish border checkpoints in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. After 2 weeks of futile and courageous resistance, the Polish armies, lacking Western support, were shattered. The Germans had outmaneuvered most of the Polish army, cutting them off from supply lines and exhausting them with relentless aerial bombing. The final blow to Poland came on September 17th, when Hitler's unlikely ally, Stalin, ordered the Soviet Union's Red Army to attack Poland from the east. As the German and Russian armies met in central Poland, the country entered into a dark era of totalitarian persecution, misery, and death. The 5-week struggle cost 200,000 lives, and it showcased the brutality the Nazi wars of aggression would bring upon the rest of Europe, with mass killings, deliberate targeting of civilians, and indiscriminate aerial bombing all commonplace. After the invasion ended, many Poles were harmed by the victors. The Soviets secretly brought 21,000 Polish officers and intellectual leaders to the Katian forest to die, while 40,000 Polish prisoners were sentenced to hard labor in the Siberian gulags. Meanwhile, the Germans enacted a deliberate and systemic genocide against the Poles from 1939 until 1945, murdering 5.4 million Poles, 3 million of whom were Jewish. Undoubtedly, the Second World War was the darkest period in Poland's modern history, and its deep scars still remain within the country's cultural memory. History requires more than memorization of past events. It demands context, analysis, curiosity, and nuance. Only then are the underlying web of cause and effect relationships visible. The millions of tragic deaths that occurred during Poland's occupation were a direct result of its quick defeat in 1939. Therefore, we must ask why Poland fell so quickly on the solemn anniversary of its invasion. As we ask these questions, you can decide for yourself if Poland's terrible fate was inevitable or if it could have been avoided.
Dnia 1 września roku pamiętnego wróg napadł na Polskę z kraju sąsiedniego. Najwięcej się użył na naszą Warszawę, Warszawo kochana, tyś jest miasto krwawe.
Before any detailed analysis of why the Poles lost so quickly in the 1939 invasion, we first need detailed historical context of the Polish interwar history. This is not only necessary, but essential to properly understand such a complex topic, with respect and nuance. The Polish people have a rich history dating back to the Piast dynasty of the 10th century. Unfortunately, not all of Poland's rich history is relevant to the discussion of 1939, so the context will be limited to the diplomatic and military history of the Second Polish Republic, which existed from 1918 to 1939. The Polish state was born from the fires of the First World War. Before the start of this war in 1914, the country had been under German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian occupation for decades. However, the Great War upset this balance of power, weakening Berlin, Moscow, and Vienna enough that Poland could break free. The first step toward this reality came in March of 1918, when the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Soviet Bolshevik government in Petrograd. This treaty gave Germany and Austria-Hungary military occupation over Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine. Eastern Europe was reshaped into a network of weak German puppet states, such as the Kingdom of Poland, the Hetmanate of the Ukrainian state, the United Baltic Duchy, the Kingdom of Lithuania, and the Duchy of Courland and Semigalia. However, this new order in the East would not last long. Throughout the summer and fall of 1918, the political and military situation began to deteriorate for both Austria-Hungary and Germany. A combination of war exhaustion, inflation, and food shortages caused by years of embargoes forced political revolutions in both empires. Facing an unprecedented internal crisis, the German military backing for these puppet states vanished, and their pro-German governments quickly collapsed. This created a power vacuum in Eastern Europe. Because of this situation, 1918 was the year many oppressed peoples of Eastern Europe, such as the Poles, Lithuanians, Czechs, Slovaks, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, gained their independence from their old masters. As these newly formed governments attempted to find stability, many had overlapping border claims and territorial disputes, leading to significant infighting. To the east of these movements, the Russian Civil War was ongoing, with back-and-forth fighting between Lenin's Red Army and a disjointed junta of anti-Bolshevik Russian generals, collectively known as the White Army. While the Red and White armies were largely preoccupied fighting each other, neither side generally supported the independence of these newly formed Eastern European countries. In Ukraine, the White Army fought the Ukrainian nationalists, and in the Baltics, Ukraine, and Belarus, the Red Army violently attacked each breakaway state. It was within this context that the Second Polish Republic emerged. The first movements toward freedom were made by Józef Pilsudski's Polish legions, who initially fought alongside the Austro-Hungarians in World War I. However, Pilsudski eventually broke with the Central Powers in 1917 and was imprisoned in Magdeburg, Germany. The first formal assertion of Polish independence came on November 6, 1918, when the Polish socialist Ignacy proclaimed the independence of a Polish republic in Lublin. However, the true consolidation of power occurred days later when Pilsudski returned to Warsaw on November 10, 1918, after being released from prison. On November 11, 1918, Pilsudski assumed national leadership in Warsaw, and this date is now recognized as the start of the Second Polish Republic. In June of 1919, the Peace Treaty of Versailles was signed, officially recognizing Poland's control of the German province of Posen and parts of West Prussia, both of which were taken by the Polish during the Greater Poland Uprising of 1918. Later, the area of West Prussia controlled by Poland was pejoratively called the Polish Corridor and became a flashpoint of Polish-German tensions in the lead-up to World War II. Part of German Upper Silesia was also transferred to Poland, but this internationally recognized border change came later in 1922. While Poland gained international recognition of its independence and the Polish-German border, the eastern borders of Poland remained ambiguous. The newly formed Polish government, heavily influenced by Pilsudski, sought to reform an iteration of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where countries like Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine would enter into a military and economic federation led by Poland. Naturally, these ambitions clashed with nationalist revolutions in Lithuania and Ukraine, which sought their own independence and territorial integrity, not Polish influence or oversight. In November of 1918, the same month that the Poles formed their government in Warsaw, the West Ukrainian People's Republic revolted across eastern Austrian Galicia, proclaiming their capital in a city the Austrians called Lemberg, the Poles called Lvov, and the Ukrainians called Lviv. However, almost half the city's inhabitants were Polish and were hostile to the idea of being controlled by a non-Polish state. Based on this perspective, many Poles revolted against the Ukrainian government, and this paved the way for a military campaign between Pilsudski's government in Warsaw and the Western Ukrainian People's Republic in Lviv. As the Polish forces pushed into eastern Galicia, the Bolshevik forces launched a bold attack against Poland and Ukraine in 1920, intent on spreading communism and reasserting Russian control over their rebellious subjects. As the Bolshevik forces rapidly gained ground throughout Eastern Europe, the Polish chief of state, Józef Pilsudski, signed a military alliance with Szymon Petliura's Ukrainian People's Republic in April of 1920. In this agreement, Petliura recognized Polish sovereignty over Western Ukraine in exchange for Polish military aid against the Bolsheviks. Once the treaty was signed, Pilsudski sent his army east, helping the Ukrainians retake Kiev and other key towns in central Ukraine in May of 1920. During this offensive, the commander, Edward Wrynski, led detachments of the Polish army. While still a minor general, he would slowly rise in rank throughout the 1920s and 30s, eventually becoming the commander-in-chief of the Polish armed forces. Despite initial success against the Red Army, the Polish and Ukrainians were outnumbered and overwhelmed by Bolshevik General Tukhachevsky's western offensive in June, rapidly retreating to avoid encirclement. By August 1920, the Poles were pushed back to the gates of Warsaw. However, Piłsudski was able to strike back with a brilliant counterattack on the Soviet rear in late August, taking 95,000 Bolshevik soldiers as prisoners. This event was known in Poland as the Miracle of the Vistula. Fighting continued throughout September and into October, when the Polish-Bolshevik ceasefire of 1920 took effect on the 18th of October. However, as the outlook of the Polish-Soviet War became more and more optimistic throughout the fall, the Poles shifted their attention to the Polish-Lithuanian conflict, which had been intermittently brewing since May of 1919. The Polish signed a League of Nations brokered ceasefire with Lithuania on October 7th, set to take effect on October 10th of 1920. However, the Polish preemptively broke this agreement before it even took effect, launching a covert invasion of Lithuania a day later, on October 8th. Here, Piłsudski's general Lukan Jaworski seized the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius on October 9th and declared the region part of the Central Lithuanian Republic on October 12th. Despite the name implying a Lithuanian autonomy, the country was a Polish-controlled puppet state, formally annexed by Poland 2 years later in 1922. This decision permanently soured relations between the two countries, which did not have normalized diplomatic relations until 1938. Even after this point, Lithuania was wary of any alliance with Poland, viewing Warsaw as a threat to its territorial integrity. As the Polish-Lithuanian War ended in 1920 and the Polish-Soviet War ended with the Treaty of Riga in 1921, Poland entered a period of tentative peacetime. Land was bought by the government and redistributed to the peasants, while factories and schools opened in urban areas. During this time, Poland entered a period of Polonization, where the Polish government restricted the rights of Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Jewish, and Belarusian minorities living in the country, imposing Polish culture and language onto them. Additionally, the status of Poland's Intermarium project floundered in this period. Instead of a grand alliance stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea as Piłsudski envisioned, Poland remained isolated. Because of the dispute over Vilnius, Lithuania and the other Baltic countries never aligned with Poland, fearing Polish imperialism and dominance over their countries. Instead, the three Baltic countries formed the Baltic Entente in 1934, excluding Poland from their newfound alliance. To the south, Poland did not have luck with the Czechoslovakian government either. The two countries had a dormant border dispute over Trans-Olza Silesia and fundamentally different outlooks on the Soviet Union. Poland saw the Soviets as a threat, while the Czechoslovakians saw alignment with them. These factors prevented the alliance from coming to pass. Because of these disagreements, the only regional alliance Poland was able to secure was one with Romania in 1921, with the shared goal of resisting Soviet aggression. Additionally, the Polish government was able to secure non-aggression pacts with the Soviets in 1932 and with the Germans in 1934, giving them a false sense of security with the countries that would bring their destruction in less than a decade. Poland's de facto leader, Piłsudski, died in 1935. Soon after, Polish diplomat Joseph Beck made modifications to Piłsudski's Intermarium alliance, instead proposing an alliance between Hungary, Romania, and Poland that he called the Third Europe. Just like the other attempted alliances, however, this one fell through for many reasons. The most significant issue was the border dispute between Hungary and Romania over Transylvania. Additionally, Hungary was already Germany-aligned and worried about Poland's anti-German stance compromising its economic and political partnership with Berlin. As the 1930s progressed, Poland remained isolated, aside from the largely symbolic Polish-Romanian alliance. Throughout the mid to late 1930s, Germany became an increasing threat to the Poles. The Nazis took control over Austria and Czechoslovakia, setting their sights on Poland. The German decision to invade Poland was driven by the ultimate goal of a full-scale war against the Soviet Union, and then an apocalyptic German genocide and resettlement of the peoples of Eastern Europe as far as Ukraine. In some diplomatic backlogs, German and Polish diplomats contemplated collaboration against the Soviet Union, but issues like the Polish Corridor and the German desire for a contiguous empire stretching from Berlin to eastern Ukraine ensured nothing came of these talks. After the German occupation of Prague and the dissolution of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939, A Franco-British-Soviet alliance was considered to protect Poland from the Germans. However, the French and British were reluctant to align themselves with the Soviet Union, which was still seen in a negative connotation throughout Western Europe. Additionally, the Polish-Soviet relations deteriorated when the Poles took advantage of Czechoslovakia's collapse to annex the Trans-Olza-Silesia county of the country. This aggravated the Soviets, who saw Poland as attacking their former ally in Prague and being complicit in the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. Despite this disapproval, Moscow offered to send up to 1 million Soviet soldiers into Poland to protect the country from any potential German aggression. The Polish government barely considered these offers, as its leaders feared that Soviet protection from Nazi Germany would come at the cost of their independence. They were not entirely wrong, as the Soviet Union later occupied the Baltic states under the same pretense, only to turn them into communist puppet states loyal to Moscow. For these reasons, the Poles rejected the Soviet offers for protection. This was a turning point, as the Soviets stopped trying to align themselves with Poland and the Western Allies. Instead, the Soviets began collaborating with Hitler, secretly signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which laid out a plan to conquer and divide Eastern Europe between both powers. Meanwhile, Britain and France guaranteed Polish independence on March 31st of 1939, hoping this would prevent Nazi invasion of the country. As a deterrent, the Poles began to mobilize in March of 1939, calling up reservists, training a handful of new units, and building modest fortifications along the western border. However, this mobilization was restrained, and Polish politicians worried more about provoking Germany than putting Poland on a war footing, since they did not yet know what the German leadership did, that war was inevitable. In contrast to the limited Polish mobilization, the Germans were fully mobilized for war and had been preparing earnestly for conquest since 1935. Their army had roughly double the number of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces compared to Poland's army. Additionally, the Germans fielded at least 500,000 more soldiers than the Poles did. As the summer months of 1939 passed, Polish intelligence began to see the military buildup of German units on the Polish borders, and it was at this time that Polish Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigł began preparing Plan West, a defensive plan against a potential German invasion of Poland. One of the key tenets of this Western defensive plan was thinly spreading the Polish army across the frontiers of the country, leaving few troops in reserve. This was done for several reasons. First, it ensured that the German incursions into Poland would be immediately opposed, forcing the French and British to declare war on Germany. There was a real fear that if Poland did not substantially resist the Germans in the contested Polish corridor, the Germans might simply occupy the country and declare victory. Second, most of Poland's industrial and population centers were near the German border, making these areas critical to the Polish war effort. Finally, not defending the entire Polish-German border might have demoralized the population and made Śmigł look like a weak leader who was ceding vital territory without substantial resistance. All of these reasons contributed to the Polish decision to defend the western frontiers from Germany. After several weeks of fighting, Śmigł planned to order his army to make a slow fighting retreat toward natural barriers like the Vistula and Bug rivers. In the final stages of his plan, Warsaw and the Modlin fortress would hold out against German assaults, as the rest of the Polish army retreated towards Lwów. Here, it would mount a final defense of the Romanian bridgehead, the area of Poland near the Romanian border. Śmigł hoped this plan would slow the German advance, inflict heavy losses on the Wehrmacht, and deny them a decisive victory over Poland. The Polish leadership believed this delay would allow the French and British to launch an offensive into the Saarland and Rhineland, which would take pressure off of Poland. With this plan in mind, the Polish army prepared for war. Knowing their navy stood no chance against the Germans, all three of their destroyers left their bases in the Baltic Sea, traveling to naval bases in the United Kingdom, where they would be safe. However, due to their wariness of provoking the German military, the Poles only fully mobilized on August 30th, 1939, only 2 days before the German military invaded. This late mobilization meant that only 600,000 of the planned 2.5 million strong army was ready to defend Poland's borders. Additionally, the Polish had outdated technology compared to the numerically superior Germans in nearly every facet of military hardware. They had telegram or courier communication, while the Germans had radios. Their anti-tank arsenal was small and unreliable. Their airplanes were obsolete, and finally their tankettes were small and ineffective against larger German armor. With these shortcomings, the Polish military was set up for failure, and the fate of its civilian populations would soon rest in the hands of the invaders. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the invasion began with the Schleswig-Holstein firing on the Westerplatte supply depot in Danzig City. Over the coming days, the German Luftwaffe brutally bombed and strafed Poland's civilians and soldiers alike. As the Polish soldiers fought on, German motorized units raced across Poland's open countryside, exploiting weak points in the Polish defenses to cut off their points of retreat. Around September 6th, Śmigł, the Polish president, the Polish National Bank, and other institutions fled Warsaw ahead of the impending German advance. By the 10th, it was clear that Śmigł's strategy of Plan West had failed. The thin Polish defenses were perfect targets for blitzkrieg tactics that emphasized breaking through weak points in enemy lines and cutting off their avenues of retreat. Because of this, much of the Pomeranian and Poznan armies were about to be encircled, and German troops were already on the outskirts of Warsaw. Additionally, the Germans had taken major cities like Poznan, Lodz, Krakow, and Danzig. A week later, on September 17th, Warsaw was completely encircled, and the Polish government was escaping into Romania, fully aware that their country was collapsing before their eyes. On the same day, the Soviet armies marched into eastern Poland, overwhelming the 9 weak border defense units in the east. Although the Polish national anthem, Poland is Not Yet Lost, played on Warsaw Radio's final broadcast on September 23rd, the country had indeed lost this war. Warsaw fell on the 28th of September, and the last resistance surrendered on October 6th, after their defeat in the Battle of Kock. The Polish campaign of 1939 was over, and Poland had been completely annexed by the Germans and their Soviet collaborators. We started this video with a question, asking why Poland fell so quickly. There are several answers to this question now that we have established context. One answer points to Poland's weak alliances. While technically supported by France and Britain, the two countries gave Poland little more than words of encouragement during the invasion. This was not the kind of alliance Poland needed to survive. Poland needed regional allies who would militarily and economically support it during its time of need. However, when 1939 came, Poland had no regional partners, since it alienated potential allies like Lithuania and Czechoslovakia, with border disputes and expansionistic overtures. Even within Poland, certain minorities, particularly the Ukrainians, were sidelined through Polonization. As a direct result of these policies, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists launched an armed rebellion against the Polish government in 1939, instead of fighting alongside it. Furthermore, Poland did little to strengthen the Polish-Romanian alliance into a serious military pact, letting it remain a friendship treaty with no serious obligations for either country to uphold. This lack of significant support from any neighboring non-Polish groups was detrimental. It made the already weak country easier for the Germans and the Soviets to invade. The next answer to the question of why Poland fell so quickly points to the poor military preparedness of the Polish army. Polish military leaders hoped to avoid a war with Germany by not provoking it. This mindset was rooted in the idea that Germany could be appeased to not invade as long as Poland did not present itself as a threat. This policy was a mistake, since it ignored the logic behind the German invasion as part of their greater plan for Lebensraum in the East, as outlined in Nazi ideology. Instead of trying to avoid war with concessions and restraint, the Polish government should have embraced the inevitability of war with Germany much earlier than it did. Instead of trusting in the Western promises of protection, the Polish have trusted in themselves, and fully mobilized their army and overall population for war with the Nazis months before September 1st. If the military leadership had done so, it could have come closer to its planned goal of 2.5 million mobilized troops, compared to the 600,000 troops the Poles were able to muster in real life. The final answer as to why the Polish state collapsed so quickly in 1939 was Śmigł's weak military strategy. Placing much of Poland's slowly-moving army in exposed terrain near the borders was a fatal mistake that played to every German strength, allowing the Germans to break through small segments of the Polish front lines and then encircle large detachments of the Polish army, cutting them off from supplies and avenues of retreat. Instead of attempting to defend the entire 1,188-mile Polish-German border, the Polish army should have concentrated its defenses around Warsaw, the Vistula and Bug rivers, and the Carpathian Mountains. These natural barriers would have been more defensible, reducing the advantage of highly mobile German units, as they would have forced the Germans to attack tight Polish lines with little room for breakthroughs and encirclements. While the Germans would have eventually advanced through these defensive lines thanks to their air superiority and advantages in armor and artillery, these gains would be costly and slow, possibly allowing Poland to survive until the French and British were ready to commit to a substantial offensive in the West. To summarize this video essay, Poland's collapse wasn't due to a single failure, but a convergence of economic, cultural, historical, and political reasons that undermined the Second Polish Republic's survival against Berlin. Chief among these reasons were Poland's regional diplomatic isolation, inadequate military preparedness, the alienation of Ukrainian and Lithuanian minorities, and Edward Szmiguł's disastrous military policy. All of these factors created the perfect storm, one that even a more unified and prepared Poland would have struggled to withstand. If Poland had made fewer mistakes, could a better outcome have been achieved? Perhaps. But such questions enter the realm of speculative fiction, as there is no way to truly know. Owing to this ambiguity, I will leave that speculation up to you, knowing only that these mistakes contributed to Poland's quick downfall, but did not necessarily define it. I hope this video helped illuminate the complex reasons behind Poland's fall in 1939. If you have any thoughts, questions, or corrections to my video, I'd love to hear them in the comment section below. Please subscribe to stay tuned for new history videos coming soon on SP History. Thank you and have a great day.